such that it is that large groups of people systemically do not become dependent in the future. So when it is that we are to ensure that people are able to keep up in like graduating from high school or from like post-secondary institution, I think that this increases their employment viability and makes it such that it is that they can probably live their incomes instead of being reliant on friends and family or social welfare. I think lastly, it's just that it is the people who comprise school boards and like the people who comprise faculty at institutions in academia, they're probably interested in making education more accessible. They chose to go into academia over their other more lucrative work, so they probably want to get people. Those are the things the OG model I'm fine with. What I'm not fine with is the model of educational flexibility, because I don't think that it just looks like, oh, now it is that administrators have the flexibility to determine how it is that they want to make their curriculum look like. I think that it is that, maybe it is that that can be true, and I'll explain why it is that that's worse, but I think that more broadly, it's probably just going to look like more individualized learning plans, more IEPs. So it's probably going to look like students being able to reweight class or course deliverables to the things that it is that they're more comfortable with, or students being able to opt into different styles of examination that correspond to like their different styles of learning, or just students having different IEPs in general. I think that there are three problems with this then. The first is that this just makes the instructional end of teaching like a lot more variable. So it makes things a lot worse for teachers and teaching assistants, and I'll give you a way as to why it is that they are particularly important within this round. I think secondly though, it makes the development of student discipline, and thirdly, epistemology significantly worse. In as far as the students can now opt into what deadlines it is that they want to pick, and opt into the sorts of like course deliverables that it is that they want to get graded upon. I think that as students are going to have the strategic incentive to only do things that they are good at, thus they're going to remain underdeveloped in things that it is that they perhaps comfortable with. That's going to be unfortunate because as OG acknowledges, when they go into the workplace, this is the thing that they're eventually going to have to deal with and they're going to be underprepared. I think on the first thing on just why it is that it makes why it makes teaching worse. So this is a couple of things, right? I think the first thing is just that it makes your work-life balance significantly worse. Because before, when it is that you're a teacher, you have the broad expectation that it is that most of your students are probably going to hand in an assignment along some specified time period, and then it is that after that time period, it is that you can go out and you can grade them. But when it is that you have IEPs that explicitly do things like accommodate for, I don't know, extensions on assessments and stuff, or give you deadlines, or maybe make it such that it is that you have to like write other assessments and stuff, I think that it means that it is that the timeline along which you are going to be grading assessments becomes significantly longer. I think that this is something that interferes with a lot of people's work-life balance. I'll talk about how this determination is just getting worse, less teachers that well. But secondarily, I think that it means that it is that you are now going to have the expectation to create many more assessments for students within your class. And this is something that is difficult, and this is something that is bad, because it is that you need to make sure that it is that all these assessments are weighted or like about some like equal in difficulty, right? The reason why it is that we see a lot of teachers repeating and reusing assessments from past years isn't because it is that they are lazy, but it is instead because it means that it is that teaching year by year actually becomes consistent. And so if it is that they want to talk about students being able to succeed within their world, something that is that you need to prove is that all of these assessments that the teachers are creating to fit individual accommodation plans or whatever are going to be weighted in such a way that is like equally difficult or whatever. But I think lastly, it's just that it is that like now it is that students are now it is that teachers are expected to be much more involved in the process of like teaching their students. And it is that the government can say, well, this is fine, but we have to take the world as it is. And I think that within the world right now, you have teachers who are going to public schools that have like class sizes of 30 to 35. It's just not feasible for you to meet and talk to every single kid there. I think that what this ultimately results in, right, is just less people wanting to become teachers, and people who are already teachers wanting to quit because it is that the work-life balance, the commitment that it is expected of them, the amount of work that it is that they are, expected to provide, the amount of pay that it is that they want to receive, is just generally worse. Why is it bad when it is that teachers quit? Because they're the ones who on either side of the house actually facilitate learning, right? It is that all of these educational outcomes that we can probably all agree are important are contingent on teachers being there and being committed and being able to teach students. This is something that I think that they are able to do to some degree in status quo. This is something that I think is a give up on their side of the house. I think the other thing though is just if it is that you want to retain like students and teaching assistants or whatever, if it is that you're going along like a supply and demand basis, another thing is probably just that it is that if you want to retain teachers or you want to increase your outreach of teachers, you probably need to then pay them more. And I think that this has been also bad because it means that it is that the schools that are able to like give good teachers and like give good instruction are just the ones that are either private or charge ridiculously high tuition, because it is that those are the only schools that are able to fund and afford and retain teachers. On how it is that I think it makes student epistemology and I think how it makes student discipline worse. On epistemology first. So I think something that is very important to note within this round is that a lot of the existing or traditional literature on like different learning styles is just complete and utter horseshit. Like the idea that it is that there are different styles of learning that are like auditory listening, or like it is that you're an experiential learner, you're a visual learner, or like you're an auditory learner. Like these are like how these are just things that are not empirically rooted in anything. They've been shown to be mythology, they've been shown to be false. But the issue is that it is that a lot of people still have the conception that this is what learning styles, and this is what educational flexibility looks like. And the reason why I think that this is so harmful is because, first of all, there's some subjects that you can really only teach in a particular way. Like I don't think that you're going to be able to listen to economics economics and then figure out how that works. I just don't think that that's super great. But secondarily, I think that it means that we're now going to have teachers who are creating a bunch of assessments that are just bogus that don't actually test for learning outcomes. I think that this is also bad. This means that when it comes to when it comes to testing students on their assessments and testing like their learning outcomes, or testing like what things that are just that they understand, I think that you're going to get significant fall through, and that you're not going to be able to test for certain learning outcomes because they're just not suitable towards particular learning styles, whatever. But on how it is that it makes student discipline worse. So I think one of the biggest things, and I fucking hate the IB program, but one of the things that I just like to credit them for is that they put so much academic pressure on me that and they had deadlines that were relatively strict and rigid, such that it is that like I had to develop a work ethic to be able to meet those deadlines. I had to be able to like force myself to work on something in order to be able to like submit something on time. And when it is that this is taken away, when it is that I have the ability to pick and choose when it is that I want my deadlines, when it is that I have the ability to simply avoid assessments entirely because it is that I don't think that it's something that I'm going to be particularly good at. Maybe it is that I'm someone who's very good at giving oral presentations, but I completely suck at essay writing. I think that what I'm ultimately tired of are things that are just like otherwise would have gotten. So the development of work ethic and the development of skills in areas in which I'm uncomfortable that OGs themselves say is needed in the workplace for the subscriber post.
Okay, you can speak for contributions, and the Prime Minister, you're here.
I first want to point out that there are obviously going to be some limits to this openness. So we're not just going to tell kids, you get to write the syllabus for the class, you get to decide exactly what the grading breakdown is, you get to decide when the deadlines are. That's what OO tries to tell you, and I don't think that that is accurate. I want to note that students will still have a required set of courses that they need to take that span all of the subjects schools think they should be well prepared in. They will still have some required assignments in those courses. Those required assignments are just more likely to be projects where they have requirements that they need to follow, but they have a little bit more leeway to, for example, take a subject for their project that will really interest them. And they will still have deadlines. We think that some flexibility with deadlines is good. For example, if a student has a real reason where issues with like extracurriculars with their family make it hard for them to meet it, but we don't think that it's just going to be, oh, you pick exactly when you turn the project in. We think it's more openness than the status quo, but not to the extreme that OO tries to characterize. With that, I want to talk about the three important groups of people in this debate. Firstly, on teachers. Secondly, on underperforming students, especially those with learning disabilities. And finally, on the students who are performing pretty well, explaining why even if the status quo works for them, our side of the house is preferable. Cool. Let's start by talking about teachers. I think that OO just tries to tell you that this is going to be terrible for teachers. They say that teachers don't have the bandwidth to do this. Firstly, why do we think that teachers are likely to do this well? As OO points out, being a teacher is already quite challenging. Pay usually isn't great, so those who go into teaching do so because they care about seeing kids learn and thrive. In many cases, teachers are unhappy then with the current curriculum. They don't like that they can see their students who struggle with standardized tests and exams and still need to grade them based on the percentage score that they get on their exam. They don't actually like that they can see in the classroom that a one-size-fits-all learning strategy doesn't work, but the administration does not give them enough flexibility to actually implement a teaching system that works for the majority of their students. OO just tries to tell you that teachers are going to hate this. We think that in many cases, this gives teachers the flexibility to teach in a way that they think is more authentic and better at achieving the learning outcomes for their students, which is what genuinely motivates them to go into work and do this job. Why do we think that this is actually good for teachers? I think firstly, it gives them more ability to connect one-on-one during the school day. OO just says it's infeasible connect with every one of them. Under the current system, sure, but when we have increasing educational flexibility, when instead of just lecturing to all 30 students at once, a teacher can give them an hour of semi-supervised work time where they can go and have an individual check-in conversation with each group of students working on the project, we think that that's what gives the teachers more ability to actually have those one-on-one interactions with their students. Because it's true that they don't have the bandwidth to do this outside of school. So if all school is exams and lectures, then we don't actually have this ability to build a connection in the same way. We think that teachers would rather have this kind of more independent project-based work rather than just exclusively lectures. But we also think that teachers genuinely like the work they're doing more under our model. Why? Because grading things like projects and seeing the genuine passion your students can have for the subjects is probably more enjoyable than just grading the same exam answers over and over again, or prepping a lecture, etc. Opposition just says this is going to take too much time. We will, because right now they can just give the same exam year after year. We actually don't think it's great for them to just continue giving the same exam year after year. We think that this leads to students doing things like getting the answer key for last year's exams. The students with the best connections just end up performing better, and it's not actually a good metric of how well your students are actually doing in the class. So while we agree that in the short term it might be a little bit of work for teachers to write up all of the new projects, etc., we still think that in the long term you can get the same benefits that OO talks about, where you can have the same project, but now instead of students being able to get the answers, you have the same project deadlines, or you have the same project description, and you have the same options, but you just get to see every year students pick new subjects that they're interested in. We think that that's more enjoyable for the teachers. Closing.
How do you monitor and ensure that teachers are making good plans that are actually accessible for students who are suffering from disability?
So we think that, I'll get to students with disabilities in a moment, but we think that administrators are probably going to be doing some level of oversight. They're still going to be checking things like the syllabus in any given class to see kind of what the grading background is, to see what the flexibility is. They're going to be having conversations with teachers, etc. We think that a lot of this happens in the status quo, but we think that it's better on our side of the house when they have more ability to actually have the flexibility needed for this type of students. So let's talk about these underperforming students, or students with disabilities. There's an entire class of students for whom the exam-based traditional learning model quite simply does not work. OO just says that the pressure that it puts on students is good. Sure, for those of us who have gotten to top universities, maybe we were the type of students who did well under this pressure cooker exam-structured model. But there's an entirely different class of students for whom this doesn't work, for whom they need this alternative learning structure. So I think OO just says that they can solve through IEPs, but we think that on their side of the house, IEPs are super limited. Why? In most cases, you need a diagnosed learning disorder. It takes a lot of time and money to even get the diagnosis in the first place, which means that in many cases, the most underprivileged students never even get that diagnosis, never even get that IEP, continue to struggle. But we also think that when this is just a small part of the learning system, these students are viewed as deviating from the norm, leading these kids to feel different, or they can't succeed in the normal educational system. It leads them to get bullied from their peers. This bullying has a real impact on them. It can genuinely lead them to drop out of school, or at the very least not think that they can apply to things like university because they don't think they can succeed, even though in reality, a lot of universities have more of this educational flexibility and have programs that would allow them to succeed. On our side of the house, then, we have two things. The first is just that these individualized educational plans are more normalized. So it's more normal for students to have them. They aren't looked down on them for this. Teachers have a better idea of how to actually cater these classroom things in order to fit students of a lot of different backgrounds. They also can just do this for all students. Even if a student doesn't already have a diagnosis, they can now get a more individualized program that works for them. We also think that we probably just need more funding and political capital for things like IEPs and more individual programs when we have more educational flexibility. We think that this isn't just a change in one classroom. This is a change across entire nations. It leads to structuring how we view education as a whole. And as the last thing, let's talk about the students who are already succeeding. We still think that our model is a lot better at the point where it better prepares them for the real world. I think that especially with things like increasing tech, where you can just Google things or even use generative AI, the skills that exams test, that is the ability to recite knowledge in a closed and timed environment, is not very important to real world knowledge. Why is our side of the house better? We think that it emphasizes more things like soft skills, like collaboration with your peers and communication, which means that even for the students who do well right now, they're likely to do better when they are learning these skills earlier. Because right now, if they do really well under the exam-based system, when they go into university and have huge projects, or when they go into the workforce and need to collaborate with people they don't see eye to eye with, they aren't going to be well prepared. On our side of the house, we build an educational system that better prepares prepare students of all levels. Very proud to stand on OG.
Thanks, Steve, for your contributions. Now we invite Yellow here.
Let's talk about what this motion is not. This motion is not that this house supports project-based learning, or this house opposes standardized curricula. It's this house supports educational flexibility. And educational flexibility, as I think it intuitively can be understood, but also explicitly being said within the inmost line as individual learning plans, I think means that it is, to some degree, it is that government bench is just going to have to bite the harm, that it is that there's probably going to be a greater amount of teacher overwork, there's probably going to be more like individualized, less standardized testing materials when it comes to students, all of these things. I think on this, then a lot of what it is that they say is already losing. Why is this the case? The first is just there's pretty much no address to the contention pointed out in Hello that it is that this makes students worse off when it is that they eventually enter into the workplace. They say that their main contention right now is that there is a group of underperforming students that are unable to graduate at all. We say that it is that this group probably isn't super comparative because I think that there are going to be symmetric incentives for you to do things like include IEPs for students with learning disabilities on either side of the house. So to that extent, I don't know what margin it is that they actually have here. They didn't quite specify how it is that students that are already relatively high achieving are going to improve from this. I'm going to tell you why it is that they aren't. But first, I really want to hammer home why it is that it is so bad when it is that students are deprived of discipline and work ethic, because this is genuinely something that I think is already round winning. It's something that it is that CG is going to have to address if they want to be off edge. The reason why it is that this is so important is just because the way in which businesses are structured, the way in which workplaces are structured, do not allow for a lot of flexibility. The reason for this is because it is that they're competitive. When it is that you offer flexibility and it is that you perhaps give more time to your workers to work on a particular assessment, it is that perhaps then the demand for whatever project or whatever product that it is that you're providing can then be usurped by another company that is able to do the exact same thing but at a slower time pace. Like you are going to have deadlines in the workplace, you are going to be expected to do presentations within the workplace. Those are things that I think that the current education system allows you and properly to some degree develops you for. I think on their side of the house it's something that it is gets avoided entirely because it is that students are able to push deadlines back and students are able to opt out of a particular assessment. I think that that's very damaging for them. I think the second thing though, and the thing that it is that Doug thinks they're probably winning off of, is just improved educational outcomes for children broadly. And the broad intuition for this is, well, if it is that we can make more flexible and individualized learning plans, maybe it is that students are better able to respond to those learning plans and they're better able to get learning outcomes as a result. Here are the things that it is that they don't do that they need to do in order for this to work. The first thing that they need to do is they need to explain why it is that these individualized curricula, these individualized testing plans, why these are going to be good and not just good, but better than what exists in the status quo. Because I think, although it is we can shit on teachers for reusing questions or reusing assessments, that practice at least ensures that it is that there is some amount of consistency year to year when it comes to the sorts of learning outcomes that instructors actually test for. It means that it is that there's a relatively comprehensive scope of material that it is that teachers ensure that it is that you know. And I think that this is the sort of thing that goes away on their side of the house because certain questions are just uncertain towards certain learning styles. Like if it is that you're an auditory learner and it is that you prefer to have things spoken to you, you're probably not suitable, you probably can't reasonably expect it to listen to a long ass passage and then be able to analyze it. It's probably better that it's written down for you. I think that this is very damaging for them then, because to the extent that it is, I don't even know if it's possible for teachers to be able to comprise tests that are uniquely difficult, that are able to test for comprehensive learning outcomes, that are able to be equally difficult. I don't know to what extent it is that they actually get what they say, which is improved educational benefits. But the second is just that I think that it is that you have incomplete educational incentives because it is that students strategically have incentives to avoid the types of assessments that it is that they are bad with. So if it is that I am an essay writer and I don't like giving oral presentations. I can choose to reweight my course, or I can choose to opt for the project that involves less oral presentation and involves more written essay writing, because that's going to be the sort of thing that I will be better at. But like I will do better at, and I'll get higher scores for it. This is something that matters to me because it is that like if I'm a high school student and high grades to get into a good post-secondary education, into a good post-secondary education if I'm in university, like I have incentives to get good grades because I think that it'll make my transcripts look better when it comes to employers and that sort of thing. I think that this has been bad because it means, again, that it is we're deprived of those learning outcomes that it is we will probably need when it comes to the workplace. I want to talk about what it is that they say though, on just teachers. So note first of all, that their concession that it is that they probably have to defend things like greater flexibility about deadlines means that the best response that it is that Gov can give you about instructor burnout is at best mitigatory. They have to concede that especially teachers within K-12 schools who they themselves concede are already overworked, they're going to have greater coursework. And I think that this is also going to apply at the post-secondary level, where it is that teaching instructors or teaching assistants are probably going to have to work longer, instructors are probably going to have to like put more time into creating assessments, those sorts of things. They're going to have greater workloads because they're expected to create new and novel assessments that they can't reference existing resources for, because those resources aren't cross-compatible. It is that they're tailored towards one specific learning style and they might not be suitable towards another. They'll be expected to tolerate like longer waiting periods when it comes to grading assessments, which means that it is that like they cannot reasonably put these things behind them. I think that all of this culminates in teachers who realize that it is that there's more that is expected of them, that it is that their pay isn't necessarily increasing, teachers that are unable to deal with that probably quit, and I think that it means that it is that like educational outcomes broadly become worse for children on their side of the house, and as far as it is that the few remaining teachers that actually, remain are probably going to be overworked, they're probably going to be overstaffed, they're going to be expected to see over several kids at once, and to the extent that it is that they're expected to have an individualized learning plan for each one of those students, or at least a broad majority of them, I think that it is that a lot of what it is that they say about how individualized learning plans improve educational outcomes probably falls through. Before I continue, I'll take a listen.
Do generalists succeed in this specialized law?
Do generalists succeed in a specialized? Yeah, I think that it is that, like, we're talking about K-12 here, we're not just talking about post-secondary education, right? There are things that you probably are going to need to know. You're allowed to probably continue to specialize well into, like, the future, but I also think that there's nuance to this, and as far as it is, like, if I'm an econ specialist, right, then it is that I'm expected to be able to both type papers and do presentations, but it is that I choose to only do one. I'm still specialized in econ, but I'm fundamentally missing part of what it is that my specialization is expected to do. I think that I'm worse for that aspect. I want to, underperforming students, I think, are relatively mitigatory. Let's talk about high achieving students, which is what I think it is that the PM wanted to talk about, but they ultimately didn't have time to. The reason that I think that it's high achieving students, and students in general, are just going to be worse on their side of the house, is just because educational outcomes are going to be worse when it is that the things that it is that they're being tested on are not comprehensive, the things that it is that they're being tested on are not consistent, the things that it is that they're being tested on are being administered by teachers that are overworked, that don't have the ability to be able to go in over, like, explain things to them. I think that this means even in their best case world, where it is that they rely on like project-based learning, they probably have to rely on other students within their classrooms who are going to have incentives to like only want to work with people that they think are smart. So I think that the underperforming students on their side of the house still fall behind, but I think on our side of the house, even the highest performing students who have to now rely on one another and not rely on like an instructor who's literally qualified to teach these sort of things, I think that they're going to have worse learning outcomes, practical outcomes.
We've been speakers, now we have we'll go back after this debate. You're here. for your contributions. Now we have a matter of opposition. Here.
Just quickly, 30 seconds for engagement. Don't verbally heckle me when you're asking for POIs, but like, just feel free to raise your hands. I'll probably take them. Ready? Starting in 3, 2, 1. The problem with educational flexibility is that it's abstract. There's no quantitative way, hell, there's no way for you to ever measure what it means or what information an individual has consumed. While that's perfectly fine for arts, it's not fine for intellectual capacity. The art is round. Saying it's flat because you perceive it a certain way or feel it a certain way doesn't change the fact, and this is incredibly important. Two things that I'm going to do in this debate. First, explicitly characterize to you what these teachers look like, what their incentives are, what children in these cases look like, what their incentives are, and lastly, overarchingly, standardization as a median is a blanket test that helps majority of the people and is probably our best shot at making an economy or the next generation that are able to take on challenges the way they do. Very quickly, this is where I'm going to deal with mostly OG and partly also closing. First, let's talk about their just in general setup. They tell you that this is going to be controlled mostly by administration and teachers. My first question then is, what's the likelihood of teachers having good enough incentives for them to actually make an individualized plan that is good enough? Fuck that. If you're talking about teachers, why will all teachers symmetrically be that caring towards individuals and students? Even if I concede to that, tell me why they're gonna wake up for their job every damn day, doing the same thing again and again, and stay motivated. Because the problem with individualized planning, guys, is simple, is that it is very variable. It's going to change every day, and it's going to change with every subject because every individual is different. But, however, there are cross borders, just individuals that have similar capacities. Your ability to memorize, your ability to retain information, your ability to calculate simple things are just things that standardization just in general targets. Very quickly, let's bring them down of why teachers won't be able to do this. First of all, you need to know that there is a teaching crisis. People are literally dropping out of teaching because of how unsisting and unregulated they are. Secondarily, they're grandly underpaid for the hours that they dictate. Thirdly, I don't think you can ever change public budgeting for state funds, which literally make up 70-80% of US educational system. Screw that. Developing nations are more screwed because that's the first budget that governments are more likely to cut back on every time an economic crisis happens. Third degree, even if I assume the best of OG and Hog bench and assume there is money, resources, people, incentive, the problem is simple. These human beings teachers are not specialized individuals because when you have to do individual planning, you don't just have to specialize in the subject, you have to have specialized information about psychology. You're dealing with a bunch of children that vary in their perceptibility because if you're accommodating variation of information intaking, you have to note that this is one teacher against 30 students who's probably taking 5 more other classes. She's sitting there planning 120 different students and how to make sure there's 120 different ways of project-based happening. If they don't want to concede to that, they have to run into the same problem. If you're taking shit out of Pinterest and project planning, that means you're still streamlining. It's a one type of project that is accessible to everyone. That is symmetrical to standardization being a blanket claim. So project-based learning is also a blanket claim if you do that for 120 different students. Lastly, let's then talk about children because I don't think any benches really talk about it. And this is incredibly important. Even if, again, I take them at their best case, you're incapable of equipping children with individualized learning because these are people who are A, accessing the most basic information, but B, people developing to begin with. These are primary children, primary schooling children, essentially meaning 10-year-old and 11-year-old people or children who don't know how they perceive information. Heck, I'm a sophomore, I still don't know if I'm better at memorizing or calculating because it's just so spontaneous for me. The issue is simple. When children in their ability and their whole rationality are incapable of figuring out what they're most likely to absorb is the problem that makes sure that even if teachers teachers are trained well enough with resources are incapable of figuring out children because they themselves don't have it figured out, which means they're going to fall back on preconceived notions of the teachers which are biased to begin with. So everything that they're trying to fit in, or all of that kind of impact they're trying to access, doesn't fall. Very quickly then, I'm perfectly fine under our world ensuring more access to ECAs, more access to other things and programs which teach you public speaking. There are debate teams in different ways. That does teach you team building. This is incredibly important because I think the administration and people as a whole got together and realized these are children and we cannot play with it. We have to discipline them. But once they gain rationality, which is post high school, we'll make sure college is more spontaneous. This is why we have liberal schooling. Secondly, why is there, at the end of the day, this standardization overarchingly good? Because note, it's very simple things. Knowing how to multiply big numbers isn't something that's perceptive. You still have to multiply it and write the number on a paper or say it out loud. There is no other way to make it project-based. Secondarily, there are things like ability to store information that are still going to be useful in reality. This is where I'm flipping your OG, right? They talk about adaptability to reality world. Reality still has deadlines. Reality still has your ability to do projects and submit it to people and will get like kind of technically graded whether this project is accepted or not. This is incredibly important because over time you might learn how to do soft skills like communication, but at the very complex part of your life where you're building your rationality, you need memorization to test and stretch the scale of your mental ability to adapt and absorb information. This is exactly why standardization is the most important thing, and if you don't do so. Very quickly before I move on, opening. Oji.
If I want the students to perform well on tests and to make them learn arithmetic, I don't need teachers. You need teachers because students have different abilities and don't know how about their strengths.
Very quickly, this is if teachers do more than just giving you tests. They teach you the content of what they're testing you on. A. B. Note that every syllabi is subjected to change every other year. This is why we change education and how it's communicated to children. This is why over time we adapted to one-on-one tuition and one-on-one tutorship, where we also had different teaching methods with like sign languages or literally having blocks and teaching 1 + 1 is 2. You see it in front of your eyes. The idea is simple. Under our world, standardization can exist, but it can be subjected to further changes that is able to adapt and accommodate more and more students and their ability to do things. Like exactly what our opening says about disability and having a lot of awareness for it. I think there are other programs that are able to target this really well, and I think we'll do that. Very quickly then, why does at the end of the debate we win this? For very simple reasons. I think I give you explicit reasons as to why teachers are inherently incapable of accommodating even if trained, but more than that, children are just in general incapable of giving you the information for you to make sure that they're adaptable, which means you on your end have to give the best form of standardization for them to grow and then go beyond and figure out what they're able to absorb as individuals. But last but not the least, I think it's incredibly important for you to know that standardization doesn't just work for 2 people, it works for the 29 out of the 30 students, which means we can accommodate the one in that one-on-one team.
Okay, we can speak for contribution. Case here.
Just feel free to raise your hand if you feel like. Before I get into the actual debate, on the top level, notice that the motion is about reducing emphasis on lectures. It's about increasing the quantity of project-based learning. It is not about scrapping the entire curriculum, letting kids show up and be like, woohoo, I really feel like going into the sound bit today. What Opt never responded to was Catherine's reasoning that claimed that there is external pressure to ensure that in some instances there is a baseline level of standardization. That is, to make sure that primary school kids can at least, for example, add or subtract so that they can do their projects later on. On our side of the house, we defend a system in which, sure, maybe a good proportion of your classes are actually in classroom, you learn the basic skills in the class, but we allow a lot of flexibility for you to take projects that allow you to take your in-class learning and propel them into areas that you find to be very enjoyable and find to be actualizing what you consider to be things that you are interested in. First, I'm going to go down CG's case. Their first argument was there's no way to measure the work that people are doing and create standardization. I'll just give you an example of how you can measure the work that people are doing. Say that you have a project. How did they frame the question? What is the quality of the sources that they use? How good is their analytical bibliography? What is their spelling, punctuation, and grammar like? What is the strength of their argument? And by the way, this will probably be externally adjudicated as well, just like all project qualifications are done, like a capstone AP exam, or alternatively the extended project qualification in the UK. It's handed over to external examiners. B, notice that this is symmetric to most in-class assignments as well. Every time you submit an essay, there's subjectivity. And the same thing happens in this project. You determine the strength of the argument, the quality of the sources. So they effectively are taking on the burden of showing you that all essay-based classes are stupid and all projects everywhere do not work and are unstandardizable. The second thing they explained was that teachers do not care about making school very engaging and these project-based learning very, very, very good for students. Two responses. First, the comparison is much worse, because let's say that those shitty teachers exist on both sides, teachers that don't really give a shit, decline. On their side of the house, you have a shitty teacher, the teacher drones on for hours and hours, you don't enjoy the subject that you're being taught because they are lecturing at you as if you were a fish in a bowl, and as a consequence you pay no attention. On our side of the house, because of Catherine's wonderful mechanisms on engagement, when you are given a project that you really, really enjoy, decline, the content is very interesting to you, you're encouraged to go, research, understand more about the field, and set the scope of parameters to things that you enjoy, and skills that work well for you, and learning styles work well for you. Even if this teacher is shit, you have the enthusiasm and the energy to go and find things out about the world for yourself, to use the plethora of internet resources available to learn things very well, all of the free textbooks, which leads to more engagement. So even if teachers don't care, you're better off on our side of the house. So we energize students to go and propel their own learning to another stratosphere where they can actually go and do things that they enjoy and learn things better. But the second is we increase the proportion of good teachers. And this was the flip that we provided in Catherine's speech. The fact that there are so many resources available online means that it is quite easy for you to have project-based learning. But above this, we increase the proportion of good teachers because we increase the publicity of what it's like to be a teacher. No longer is being a teacher what you see on the media or what you've experienced in the classroom in high school, where you just sit there and you drone at kids 30 blank faces who don't really care about you. But now it's an opportunity to have a one-to-one direct connection and impact with students and feel that what you are doing is meaningful in someone else's life. This is important because a lot of people, before they become teachers, do things like have teaching experiences and go and experience teaching in the real world. These teachers get unretained because they realize teaching is actually bad. You just sit there, you talk, and you don't really learn anything, you don't really impact the students very carefully. But when they get to experience having one-to-one connections, when they get to experience having a lot of enjoyment, because the syllabus isn't the same every single year, you get the ability to learn about something new with your students. You feel like you're having a big impact, and this increases the publicity of what it's like to be a teacher, and more smart people see teaching as a good use of their time, because it uses their brain. It's not just reading out a textbook, it's providing one-to-one support on the student's unique project, and providing and propelling people to like another level in their education, which increases the recruitment effort for good teachers. But third, because we reduce burnout, because of the fact that you have direct engagement with students, you enjoy yourself to create connections with students, that means you enjoy the subject more, the teaching becomes more of a hobby, more of a passion, and this reduces the amount of burnout you have. And even if you work longer hours, if you enjoy it, you're likely to do it more. This is why, I do school for like 80 hours a week, but because I enjoy math, it's not that deep. But if I were doing English, it'd probably be really, really boring. I'll take Liz.
Of course, projects, I could be an introvert, so what other methods are you going to adapt for these children?
I don't understand why being an introvert harms you in doing projects. In fact, we say it benefits you when you're doing projects. Because no longer is your teaching dependent on your confidence in raising your hand in a class of 30, but a teacher engages with you one-to-one, helps to bring you out of your shell by talking about something that you really enjoy, and provides you with confidence incrementally by giving you support and saying, wow, you've identified a really interesting and compelling topic. Wow, you structured this argument very well. Whereas where the opportunities for feedback that is one-to-one and personal is very limited on their side of the house, because they resort to my opening.
This comparative is just blatantly asymmetric. On our side of the house, teachers are shit and they drone on and on. On their side of the house, teachers are still shit, but they participate in one-on-ones with students, they give detailed feedback, and they also give out assignments that students somehow get so invested in that they voluntarily learn that content themselves. Like, this just does not seem charitable at all.
That's just not a response to any of my mechanisms. We told you that teaching gets better because teachers are less burnt out and enjoy the subject more. Because we provide more resources to teachers because we have better recruitment efforts, which leads to more qualified teachers. This doesn't respond to any of this. It's still a unique benefit, even if teachers are bad on both sides of the house, to say that students learn more because they engage in projects on their own. So that's not symmetric on their side of the house either. Then they said there's no resources. One, internet. 2, private schools offer resources because they encourage to be charitable to schools around them. Partnership schools exist, and this leads to a lot of resource affiliation. Third, related organizations now step in more when it comes to schools and create more collaboration with schools. For example, now the science fair can have a curriculum spot in a school because students are more encouraged to do personal projects, which means you get external projects in your schools, which leads to a lot of goodness. Third, remember, flexibility isn't just rocking up, which means we get better things outside of the house. Fourth, you're able to figure out your students better when you have one-to-one interactions with them, so that undercuts their argument that it takes a lot of effort to understand what your students want. And fifth, even if they are doing things like learning about numbers, one, you can still have classes about numbers, and two, you can have projects about numbers, for example, basic modeling projects. Now I want to move on to opening opposition. The first thing is, we already dealt with the argument that teaching gets worse. Second, we'll deal with the argument on discipline. Discipline is better on our side of the house. One, because you have more control of your education, because you're more engaged with your education, you feel less bored, and you feel more challenged, and you feel more appreciated by the teacher, so you're less likely to lash out. Two, there are benchmarks for discipline, right? If your student is very, very, very disciplined poor, you might not choose to give them as much flexibility as others. Next, I want to talk about this style of learning bullshit. They never really explain to you why there isn't styles of learning, they just said there's no literature. Comparatively, there probably is, because one, for example, if you're a debater, you listen more, so you're more acclimatized to listening. Two, people have natural advantages and disadvantages in different areas. And three, if you enjoy something more, like you enjoy listening to things more, for example, you might enjoy movies more than stories, for example, then adapting the style of learning to which you enjoy activates all of Catherine's mechanisms on enjoyment. So we win all of these arguments.
We thank your speakers for your contributions. Now we invite up the officers for this to close up the talk, please, as well as around as a whole. Here, here.
Can you just give me 1 minute to arrange my notes, please?
No problem.
Thanks. I'll take yours just non-verbally, just raise your hand and we'll take your... Cool. Yep. This is my speech in 3, 2, 1. Closing opposition does not go against the norm that teaching is a tough job that is severely underpaid, meaning that it is very difficult to get good teachers to do the individualized expectations that OG and CG are expecting. I would also like the panel to note very quickly that the relative softness in terms of stance that progressed as you went from OG to CG, as they flagged, no, we're going to make everything relatively the same, but we're just going to change it and tweak it a little bit, is not a fair burden for them to take on this debate. I'll tell you how I'm going to structure my speech and then tell you why I way over opening opposition, who I actually think is in the one. Cool. Let's deal with CG first. I'm going to talk about 3 things. 1, they told me if you still have exams and you still have tests, then it's going to be fine. But my problem is the entire case was structured around the fact that kids don't like taking tests and kids don't like the relative standardization. They need to prove to me then why it is and what is the margin of change. Because it is presumable that there is some levels of creativity that exists on our side. You still have access to clubs, you still have access to group projects. These things still exist within standardized education. It's literally expected within some syllabi. I don't understand where it is they change in terms of delta. They needed to try their bullet and they missed it. But finally, they said you're still going to be highly disciplined. I think that completely counters the entirety of Gov's case in terms of why we want there to be flexibility in terms of Gov. Cool. They told me that this is going to be done well for 3 reasons. 1, because now you have access to flexible resources. 1, response, it's symmetric. You have accessible and flexible resources on my side. You have things like Khan Academy. I survived my macroeconomic class because of my YouTube instructor, not because of my professor. I don't think that that's not symmetric on my side. But 2, they just asserted that this is going to be good projects and good resources. Understand it's Google and Pinterest. I don't think this is the way in which you can measure whether this is going to be good. But finally, there is absolutely no monitoring that is going to be happening on their side. Because to do these kinds of things, you need to hire about 10 more people to do these. These are incredibly underpowered areas. I don't understand why that's true. But finally, it's about the scale of finding a good project. It's much easier for me to trust Khan Academy than trust one random Pinterest user who posts these kinds of things. So the scale of finding a good project is relatively much harder. Finally though, when I asked them that POI about how can you monitor that this will be done well, their only argumentation was that students will make sure that they take care of each other, they will be accountable. One, if you're a bad student, you're probably still going to be really bad, you're probably not even going to show up to your class. So the impact then is that the other students will pick up the slack of that bad student. Or thirdly, and probably the most likely, all students fail that group project when the bad student doesn't. I don't understand why suddenly the bad student suddenly becomes all of a sudden good. They told me then, okay, but teachers have time and it's just symmetric. It takes 30 minutes for a teacher to mark MCQs because they put it through a system. It takes 5 hours for students to sit with their students individually to identify singular tasks and singular projects that work for them. The workload gets infinitely much more. They didn't mechanize why it is likely that it is symmetric. But two, they don't necessarily tell you that, oh, they told you that bad teachers are probably going to be existing on both sides, and I agree. But it's the likelihood of students succeeding in my class being much higher. Because now it's much easier for me to pass a math test that bad teacher probably didn't make, but now I have to sit with that bad teacher who I probably don't like and identify an individualized story to work with them, and it's probably going to be subjectively graded. It's significantly harder for me to get a good grade. I don't know why that is probably going to change. But finally, I think the most important thing is that on our side, one, creativity still exists. Lamia told you can have access to clubs and societies, you can do all those these kinds of things, and our syllabus does accommodate for all these kinds of things. I don't know why that's necessarily a bad thing. But finally, I think they needed to contest a little bit more on the standardization, because it's not that hard to pass a math class, and they're right, and that is relatively important. Because insofar as that is true, your likelihood of succeeding on our side is still symmetric. Then they needed to weigh out about why is it likely the students are probably going to be happier, and I don't think they're able to do it because they took such a soft stance in saying that you're still going to have all the basic things that exist in my world. You need to take a tougher stance on that. I'm going to move to OG, so perfect time for a POI.
If you're a student who learns well from lectures, as you can see, your YouTube videos are probably better than your teacher anyways. But our side of the house is the only side that gives you the opportunity to learn through alternate means instead, for example through projects, and that's how your learning style works.
Cool. I'm going to do a few responses and I'll integrate my responses into that. But I think the biggest problem that I have with OG, and I'll take them on this first, is their oversight, which perfectly goes into that POI. Because few things. One, you need to have significantly more oversight as to how these projects will be done well, and understand the entire argumentation was structured in minority areas that are incredibly impoverished. So they did 3 assertions in their speech. One, that autonomy is good. I don't know why. I don't know why schools are that good, because it is significantly getting harder to hire really good teachers. That's not probably going to happen more. But also, now you're relying on your teachers being really good and your administration being really good. On our side, oversight gets significantly easier because you are ensuring that you still have people that can monitor things easier. Because it's much easier to make sure that your teachers doing a good job if you can look at your paper grades and see whether your kids, majority of them are failing or passing. It's much easier for me to monitor and analyze that, as opposed to me understanding individualized cases. So that means it allows bad teachers to get away with doing a really, really bad job. And this is especially harmful in areas where it matters the most. But finally, they asserted that the government will just give them more money. I'm not taking one other POI. And that's just insane. Why? These are still severely underpowered areas. This is not the real world. We need to debate in a world where you actually have funding to do these kinds of things. But thirdly, they didn't tell me like how this actually improves students' acceptances into scholarships and universities. Because they said something very important. He said rich kids probably like the standardized systems the most because they have the best resources. Insofar as that is true, there's probably going to be a distinction between how you value GPAs. So most likely, it is still going to be the minority kids who are probably going to be the ones taking these flexible types of systems, and just significantly easier to discriminate them against if when you have the GPAs still not matching up in the same way. I don't know why that's a good thing. But finally, they said dropping out is going to happen. One, I don't know why that's bad. 2 of my friends dropped out and they're doing fucking great. But 2, there are other resources and ways in which you can not drop out. Finally, they told me that like teachers will always be good good. I think I've done a relatively good amount of responding to this. I think you're just going to give them significantly more work. The reason why we lay over opening is very simple. Because we're the only thing to tell you specifically why children will not probably adapt to these kinds of things well. Why they are still learning, why they're still in secondary school, while they still don't know whether they are probably going to be the best, like a math professor, or they're probably going to be a teacher. They don't know this and have zero capacity to change. And for those reasons, choose oppositions.
Okay, we take speeches over the announcement of the contribution. Anybody press the floor, shake hands. We have time for a short period of deliberation, and then we'll close it out.